They had been told 1,000 times over that death was preferable to surrender. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. Yet on that September morning in 1945, when gunfire tore through the jungle camp, these Japanese women ran not towards death, but towards the Americans, towards the very enemy they had been taught to fear more than dying itself. The Marine sentries froze, rifles half raised. 37 women in torn clothing stumbled from the jungle, screaming in fractured English. One soldier shouted what everyone was thinking: "Don't shoot!" They're women. What followed would challenge everything. Both sides believed about war, about enemies, about survival. It began not with bullets or bombs, but with something far simpler: someone offering help instead of harm. This channel isn't just about war stories, it's about human stories. Courage, struggle, ingenuity, sacrifice. If that speaks to you the way it speaks to us, feel free to subscribe and stay with us. We're building something meaningful here. The island of Saipan in September 1945 resembled a graveyard dressed in tropical green. Palm trees swayed above bomb craters. Rusted Japanese tanks sat half buried in sand. The air carried the scent of salt water mixed with something older, darker. The lingering trace of a battle that had ended over a year before but still haunted every inch of ground. Camp Baker occupied the island's northern edge, a collection of canvas tents and wooden structures enclosed by barbed wire. American Marines patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The war was finished. Japan had surrendered. Yet here on Saipan, small pockets of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the jungle, refusing to believe their emperor had spoken words of defeat. The peace section of Camp Baker held mostly Japanese soldiers. Men with hollow eyes and torn uniforms who had finally emerged from caves after months in hiding. They shuffled through the camp like specters, unable to process that they remained alive. The Americans had anticipated these soldiers. They had procedures in place. Interpreters ready, medical supplies prepared. What they did not expect were the women. It began with shouting, not the usual morning sounds of camp life, but urgent voices. Japanese, then English, then chaos. Corporal James Mitchell was on perimeter duty when he heard it. The sound came from the jungle tree line, roughly 200 yards distant. At first, he assumed it was another group of soldiers finally ready to surrender. He had witnessed it before. Men emerging slowly, hands raised, faces blank with exhaustion and defeat. But this was different. This was running. This was panic. Then he saw them. Figures breaking through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks, moving quickly despite obvious exhaustion. The morning sun caught dark hair and pale fabric. His finger moved instinctively to the rifle trigger. Training took over. Identify the threat, assess the situation. But his brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. They were women, Japanese women, and they were running towards him. Behind them, gunfire cracked through the morning air. Not American weapons, Japanese rifles. Someone in the jungle was shooting at these women. Mitchell's voice emerged as a shout, before the thought could intervene. "Don't shoot, they're women!" The other sentries had already raised their rifles, fingers on triggers, following their training. But Mitchell's words cut through their instincts. They froze. The women reached the wire. 37 of them, Mitchell would later learn, though in that moment it appeared to be 100. They pressed against the fence, hands gripping metal, voices crying out in Japanese and broken English. "Please," one shouted, "help, please help!" Their clothing was torn and filthy. Some had no shoes. Blood stained several garments. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wide with terror and something else. Desperation beyond anything Mitchell had witnessed even in combat. More gunfire cracked from the jungle. Bullets struck the ground near the women. They screamed and dropped, pressing themselves against the base of the fence. Mitchell made a decision. "Open the gate," he shouted, "now." A private hesitated. "Sir, we don't have authorization for—" "Open the damn gate." The gate swung open. The women poured through, some crawling, some stumbling. all moving as quickly as their exhausted bodies would permit. Mitchell and the other Marines formed a protective line between the women and the jungle, rifles raised towards the tree line. The shooting stopped. Whoever had been firing at these women had disappeared back into the green darkness. Behind the Marines, the women collapsed. Some sat in the dirt, heads in hands, shoulders shaking. Others lay flat on their backs, chests heaving, staring at the sky as though they could not believe they were still breathing. One woman, small and young, perhaps 20, looked up at Mitchell with tears streaming down her face. She said something in Japanese he could not understand, but he required no translation. Her expression said everything. It said thank you. It said I am alive. It said I cannot believe you did not shoot me. Camp Baker had just received its most unexpected prisoners of war, and nobody knew what to do with them. Lieutenant Robert Chen arrived at the scene 10 minutes after the women came through the gate. He was the camp's senior Japanese-American interpreter, a Nisei soldier who had spent the war translating interrogations and surrender documents. He had seen thousands of Japanese prisoners, but never women, never civilians, and never anyone in this condition. The women sat grouped under the shade of a supply tent, surrounded by nervous Marines who had no idea what to do. Chen approached slowly, hands visible, speaking in careful Japanese. "You're safe now. We will not harm you. Can you tell me who you are?" The young woman who had looked at Mitchell spoke first. Her name was Ko. She had been a nurse at a Japanese field hospital in the jungle. When the battle for Saipan ended in July 1944, she and dozens of other nurses had fled into the mountains with surviving soldiers. For over a year, they had lived in caves, surviving on whatever they could find, slowly starving. But then the surrender came. Most of the soldiers wanted to turn themselves in, but a small group of officers refused. They said the surrender was American propaganda. They said the Emperor would never give such an order, and they said that any soldier or nurse who tried to leave would be shot as a traitor. "They told us we had to die," Ko said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "If we tried to leave, they would kill us. If we stayed, we would starve. This morning, they started arguing about whether to shoot all of us or make us jump from the cliff. Some of the officers wanted a mass suicide. They said it was the only honorable choice left. That is when we ran." Chen translated for the gathered officers and medics. The camp doctor, Captain William Hayes, listened with his jaw tight. He had treated wounded Japanese soldiers before, but this was different. These were not combatants. These were victims. "Get them to the medical tent," Hayes ordered. "All of them. I want full examinations. Food, water, clean clothes. Now." The women were led to the camp hospital, to a large tent with cots and medical supplies. Navy corpsmen began the process of triage. What they discovered shocked them. Every single woman was malnourished to the point of starvation. Several had untreated wounds, cuts, infections, broken bones that had healed incorrectly. Their feet were torn and bleeding from walking barefoot through the jungle for over a year. Lice infested their hair, skin infections covered their arms and legs. One corpsman, a young man from Iowa named Danny Walsh, found himself treating a woman who could not have been older than 18. She sat on the cot, staring straight ahead, unresponsive. He cleaned the cuts on her feet as gently as he could. She flinched at first, then slowly relaxed. When he finished and offered her a clean bandage, she looked at him with an expression he would never forget. Confusion mixed with disbelief, as if kindness was a language she had forgotten how to speak. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. After the medical checks came food. The mess sergeant, a gruff man named Vincent Rossi, received orders to feed 37 unexpected guests. He looked at his supplies, did some quick mathematics, and started barking orders to his kitchen staff. Within an hour, they had prepared a meal. Nothing fancy, white rice, a staple the women would recognize, grilled fish, tinned vegetables, bread with butter, hot tea, and for dessert, tinned peaches in syrup. The portions were small, doctor's orders. These women were starving, and too much food too quickly could kill them. The women were brought to a section of the mess tent that had been cleared for them. They sat at long tables. dressed now in clean US Army shirts that hung loose on their thin frames, their hair washed and tied back. Marine guards stood at the exits, but their postures were relaxed. These were not dangerous prisoners. These were survivors. When the food arrived, carried on metal trays by mess staff, the women went silent. They stared at the plates, white rice still steaming, real fish, not the raw scraps they had been eating in the jungle, bread that smelled like heaven. One woman reached out slowly, touched the rice with her finger, as if checking whether it was real. Then she looked at Lieutenant Chen, who stood nearby, and asked a question in Japanese. Chen translated. She wants to know if this is truly for them. Yes, Hayes said. Tell them they can eat. Tell them they are safe. The first woman to eat was Ko. She picked up a spoon, her hands shook, and scooped a small amount of rice into her mouth. She chewed slowly, eyes closed. Tears ran down her cheeks. She covered her mouth with one hand, trying to hold back sobs, but failing. Around her, other women began to eat. Some ate quickly, desperately, unable to stop themselves despite knowing they should go slowly. Others ate with painful slowness, savoring every grain of rice, every bite of fish, as though afraid the food would disappear. Walsh, the young corpsman, watched from the edge of the tent. He had seen a great many things in this war, but watching these women cry over a simple meal, that struck differently. One of the older Marines, a sergeant who had fought at Guadalcanal, stood beside him. The sergeant's face was hard, weathered by combat and loss, but his eyes were wet. They ain't the enemy, the sergeant said quietly. Not these ones. When the meal ended, several women bowed deeply to the messed stuff. Some pressed their hands together in thanks. Ko approached Chen and spoke in Japanese. He translated. She says they cannot believe this is real. She says in the jungle they had been eating grass and insects. She says her friend died last month from starvation. She says she thought they would all die. She says this meal is the first kindness any of them have received in over a year. The question of where to house 37 Japanese women in a POW camp designed for male soldiers created an immediate problem. The camp commander, Colonel Douglas Wright, held an emergency meeting with his staff. They could not put the women in with the male Japanese POWs. That would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous. They could not keep them in the medical tent forever. And they certainly could not simply let them wander freely about the camp. The solution was improvised, but effective. A section of the camp near the administrative buildings was cleared. 3 large squad tents were erected, their floors lined with wooden pallets to keep them off the ground. Cots were brought in, along with blankets, pillows, and mosquito netting. A separate latrine area was constructed with canvas walls for privacy. Marine guards were posted at a respectful distance, close enough to maintain security, far enough to give the women space. That first night, the women entered their new quarters with obvious fear. They had been told many times by their own officers what would happen if they were captured by Americans. The stories had been graphic and terrible. Now exhausted and vulnerable, they were about to sleep in American tents, surrounded by American soldiers. Some expected the worst, but the worst did not come. Guards remained outside. No one entered without permission. At lights out, the camp fell into the same quiet routine it followed every night. The women lay on their cots, clean for the first time in a year, their stomachs full for the first time in months, surrounded by canvas walls instead of jungle darkness. Ko could not sleep. She stared at the canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp. American voices in the distance, the hum of generators, the call of nightbirds, normal sounds, safe sounds. She thought about the cave where she had slept the night before, the cold stone, the constant fear, the officer who had stood at the entrance with a rifle, ensuring no one tried to escape, the whispered conversations about whether it was better to die quickly or slowly. Now she lay on a cot with a pillow beneath her head and a blanket that smelled like soap. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from something more complicated. Relief mixed with guilt. Gratitude mixed with confusion. She was alive. They were all alive. And the Americans, the monsters from the propaganda, had fed them, treated their wounds, and given them beds. Beside her, another woman whispered in the darkness, "Ko, are we really safe?" Ko did not know how to answer, so she said the only thing she could. "For tonight." "Yes, we are safe for tonight." The following morning began with confusion. No one had told the women what to do, where to go, or what was expected of them. They woke with the dawn, as they always had, and sat on their cots waiting for orders. In the jungle, life had been dictated by strict military discipline. Wake, work to eat what little food existed, sleep, repeat. But here, no one came to order them about. Around 7 in the morning, Lieutenant Chen arrived with breakfast. Not rations or minimal portions, but proper breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, coffee. The women stared at it with the same disbelief as the day before. Chen explained through translation that they were free to eat whenever meals were served. They could move about the women's section of the camp. They could request medical care if needed. They were prisoners, yes, but they would be treated humanely. One of the older women, a former teacher named Fumiko, asked the question on everyone's mind. What will happen to us? Chen was honest. We do not know yet. The war has only just ended. Repatriation plans are still being worked out. For now, you will stay here. You will be safe, you will be fed, and you will be treated with respect. Days turned into a routine. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. The women were given basic supplies, toothbrushes, soap, clean clothes. The US Army did not have women's uniforms in stock, so they received men's shirts and trousers, which they rolled up and tied to fit. Some of the women knew how to sew. They were given needles and thread and began altering the clothes to fit better. Medical checkups continued. Dr. Hayes personally oversaw the treatment of the more serious cases. Several women had infections requiring antibiotics. One woman had a broken arm that had healed incorrectly and needed to be rebroken and set properly. Another had severe malnutrition that required weeks of carefully managed feeding to bring her body back to a healthy weight. The women were not given work assignments like the male POWs. The Geneva Convention had rules about prisoner labor, but more importantly, these women needed time to recover physically and mentally. However, doing nothing proved difficult for them. They had spent over a year in constant survival mode. Sitting idle felt wrong. Ko was the first to ask if they could help somehow. Chen brought the question to Colonel Wright. After some discussion, the women were allowed to volunteer for light tasks. They could help in the mess tent with food preparation. They could tend the small vegetable garden the camp maintained. They could do laundry or mending. Nothing strenuous, nothing required, but the option was there. Most of the women chose to work. It gave them purpose. It made them feel less like burdens. And it allowed them to contribute something in return for the care they were receiving. Ko worked in the mess tent, helping Sergeant Rossi prepare meals. At first he was skeptical. She was a former enemy after all. But within days he found himself actually enjoying her company. She was efficient, quiet, and had a skill for cooking rice perfectly every time, something his own cooks had never quite mastered. A quick note. If you're enjoying this, subscribing really does make a difference. Now back to the story. Letters became a source of pain. The Red Cross had established mail routes for POWs, allowing them to send and receive limited correspondence with family back in Japan. When the women learnt they could write home, many cried with relief. They had not been able to contact their families in over a year. Parents thought they were dead. Children had been told their mothers would never return. But when replies finally came back weeks later, the letters told stories that made the women's improved conditions feel like a cruel joke. Japan was devastated. Cities had been firebombed into ash. Food was scarce. Families were living in the rubble of destroyed homes. One woman received a letter from her mother describing how they had been eating tree bark soup for months. Another learnt that her younger brother had died from malnutrition during the winter. Ko's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and torn at the edges. The message was brief. Your father died in February. We thought you were dead too. I cannot believe you're alive. Tokyo is gone. Everything is gone. But you're alive. That is all that matters. She read the letter, sitting on her cot, surrounded by the comfortable tent, the clean clothes, the full stomach. Her father was dead. Her city was destroyed. Her family was starving. And she was here, safe and fed, living better than she had in years. The guilt crushed her. She folded the letter carefully, placed it beneath her pillow, and walked outside into the bright Pacific sun. The contrast was unbearable. At night, the women talked in hushed voices about this paradox. They observed American abundance everywhere. The mess hall threw away more food in a day than they had eaten in a month in the jungle. American soldiers complained about rations that seemed like feasts. Supplies arrived constantly. Clothes, medicine, equipment, cigarettes, sweets. The wealth was staggering. They can afford to be kind, Fumiko said one evening. When you have everything, generosity costs nothing. But Ko was not certain. She had seen the faces of the American soldiers, the young corpsman who treated her feet with such gentleness, the sergeant in the mess hall who always ensured she got extra portions to help her gain weight, the guards who could have been cruel but chose to be respectful. This was not merely about abundance, this was about something else, something she could not quite name yet. The breakthrough came through small gestures. Corpsman Walsh had been assigned to check on the women's medical conditions every few days. During one visit, he noticed the young woman he had treated on the first day, her name was Yuki, sitting alone, staring at nothing. He sat down nearby, not too close, and pulled out a chocolate bar from his pocket. He broke it in half and offered her a piece. She looked at the chocolate as though it were a miracle. In the jungle, sugar had been a distant memory. She took it with trembling hands and said something in Japanese. Walsh did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Thank you. She bit into the chocolate and closed her eyes. A small smile appeared on her face, the first smile Walsh had seen from any of the women. That simple exchange started something. Other soldiers began bringing small gifts when they could. A Marine gave Ko a comb for her hair. A cook saved extra fruit for Fumiko, who mentioned once through translation that she missed apples. These were not grand gestures, they were tiny acts of humanity between people who were supposed to be enemies. Language became a bridge. The women began learning English words. Hello, thank you, good morning. The Americans learnt a few Japanese phrases. The pronunciation was terrible on both sides, but that made it funnier. Laughter began to replace silence. Not constant laughter, and never without the shadow of war hanging over everything, but genuine moments of lightness. One afternoon, Sergeant Rossi was teaching Ko how to make American-style pancakes. He demonstrated flipping one in the pan. She tried. The pancake landed on the floor. They both stared at it for a moment. Then Rossi started laughing. Ko started laughing. The other kitchen staff joined in. For just a few minutes, the war did not exist. There was only a ruined pancake and the shared absurdity of the moment. But these moments were complicated. Ko knew men like Rossi had probably killed Japanese soldiers. Rossi knew women like Ko had supported the military that killed his friends. Both sides carried grief and loss. Yet here they were, laughing over pancakes. The contradiction gnawed at everyone, but it also opened a door. If they could laugh together, if they could share chocolate and teach each other words, then perhaps the enemy was not what propaganda had claimed. The memory of the jungle faded slowly. The women began to gain weight. Their faces filled out. Color returned to their skin. Hair grew healthy and strong again. The physical transformation was remarkable. But more significant was the mental shift. They stopped flinching every time an American walked past. They stopped expecting violence. They began to believe, slowly and carefully, that they might actually survive this. 2 months into captivity, Ko found herself facing a truth she did not know how to process. She stood in the mess tent, preparing rice for dinner, working alongside American soldiers who treated her like a colleague, not a prisoner. Her stomach was full, her body was healthy. She wore clean clothes and slept on a comfortable cot. She was, by every measure, living better than she had in years. But she was supposed to be dead. Every piece of her training, every word from her superiors, every lesson drilled into her mind since childhood said that capture was worse than death, that enemies showed no mercy, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. She had been raised to believe that if she ever fell into American hands, she would be tortured, humiliated, and killed. The propaganda had been specific and graphic. Yet here she was, not tortured, not humiliated, not dead. Instead, she was cooking rice whilst Sergeant Rossi told jokes in broken Japanese that made no sense but somehow still made her smile. The disconnect was staggering. At night, she lay awake wrestling with impossible questions. If the propaganda had lied about the Americans, if they were not the monsters described, then what else was a lie? What about the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere? What about Japan's divine mission? What about the promises that dying for the emperor was the highest honor? The questions were dangerous. They felt like betrayal. But she could not stop thinking them. If the enemy could show this much humanity, this much mercy, then perhaps her own nation had sent her into the jungle, die for lies. Fumiko struggled with similar thoughts, but from a different angle. She had been a teacher before the war. She had taught children about duty, honor, and sacrifice. She had believed in what she taught. But now watching American soldiers laugh and joke, watching them treat Japanese prisoners with basic decency, she could not reconcile her beliefs with reality. I told children that Americans were devils, she confessed to Ko one evening. I told them to be proud to die rather than surrender. What do I do with that now? How do I live knowing I sent children towards death with lies? Ko had no answer. She only knew that every meal she ate, every kindness she received, every moment of safety she experienced in this camp made her old beliefs crumble a little more. The women talked about it, not openly at first, but in whispers after lights out. Some refused to question anything. They clung to their beliefs like life preservers, insisting that their treatment was some sort of trick, that the Americans were simply skilled at propaganda themselves. These women kept their distance from the soldiers, accepted only the minimum care required, and spoke about returning to Japan with the conviction of the faithful. But most of the women could not maintain that denial. The evidence was too strong, the kindness too consistent. They saw American soldiers writing letters home, crying over photographs of family members killed in the war, yet still treating Japanese prisoners with respect. They saw wealth beyond imagination, being shared rather than hoarded. They saw a system that valued individual lives, even of the enemy lives, in ways that contradicted everything they had been taught. If they value our lives when we are their enemies, Yuki asked one night, then why did our own officers want us to die? The question hung in the dark tent like smoke. No one answered, because the answer was too painful. Their own military had been willing to kill them rather than let them surrender. The Americans had saved them instead. Lieutenant Chen became a crucial figure in this transformation. As the interpreter, he spent hours with the women, translating not just words, but concepts. He was Japanese-American, a man who had grown up in California, who had been sent to an internment camp at the start of the war, and who had then volunteered to serve in the US military to prove his loyalty. His story fascinated and confused the women. "You are Japanese," Fumiko said to him during one conversation, "but you fight for America. How can you choose them over your own people?" Chen's response was careful. "I am American. My parents came from Japan, yes. But I was born in California. This is my country. And even when my country wronged me, even when they put my family behind barbed wire, I still believed in what America is supposed to stand for. Freedom, democracy, the idea that all men are created equal. Japan does not believe in those things. Japan believes in hierarchy, in sacrifice for the state, in divine right. I could not serve that." The women listened carefully. These ideas, freedom, equality, individual worth, were foreign concepts. But living in Camp Baker, they were starting to see what those ideas looked like in practice. Soldiers of different backgrounds working together, officers who listened to enlisted men, medical care given regardless of rank or status. The concept that even enemy prisoners deserved dignity. The turning point came during a film night. The camp had a projector and would show films periodically for entertainment. Usually, the women stayed in their tents during these events. But one evening, Colonel Wright suggested through Chen that they might enjoy watching. The film was a comedy, something light and silly about a soldier getting into ridiculous situations. Nothing serious, nothing political. The women sat at the back, nervous, unsure if they were allowed to laugh. But the film was genuinely funny. Physical comedy that needed no translation, a soldier falling down, another getting hit in the face with a pie. Slapstick humor that was universal. Co found herself smiling, then laughing hard alongside American soldiers who were laughing at the same jokes. When the film ended, she sat in the darkness, catching her breath, and realized something profound. For 90 minutes, she had forgotten about the war. She had forgotten about sides and enemies. She had simply been a person watching a film with other people, all of them finding the same things funny. Humanity had won over ideology for a brief moment, and it felt like a revelation. The Americans, too, were experiencing their own shift. Corporal Mitchell, the sentry who had first seen the women running from the jungle, had initially viewed them simply as unexpected prisoners. But over weeks of watching them work, laugh, struggle with English, slowly come back to life, he began to see them as individuals. Ko was not just a Japanese prisoner. She was a woman who loved cooking, who had lost her father, who hummed quietly when she thought no one was listening. "You know what's strange?" he said to Walsh one evening. "I keep forgetting they're Japanese. I just see them as people. Is that wrong?" Walsh shook his head. "I don't think so. I think that's perhaps the only thing that's right about any of this." The greatest weapon, it turned out, was dignity. Not bullets or bombs or propaganda, but the simple act of treating people like human beings. The women had expected to be broken by cruelty. Instead, they were being broken by kindness. And it was forcing them to rebuild everything they thought they knew about the world. Ko started keeping her journal. She wrote in Japanese, hiding it beneath her mattress, afraid someone might read it, but needing to process what was happening. One entry, written 3 months into her captivity, captured the transformation. "We were taught that Americans are devils without honor. But every day they show us more honor than our own officers ever did. They feed us when we are hungry. They heal us when we are sick. They let us laugh. They treat us like we matter. I do not know what to believe anymore. All I know is that I'm alive, and I was supposed to be dead. Perhaps being alive is enough. Perhaps questioning everything I was taught is not betrayal. Perhaps it is the first honest thing I've done in years." The moment of complete transformation came unexpectedly. It was December 1945, 4 months after the women had arrived. Christmas decorations were going up round the camp. The Americans were preparing for the holiday with an enthusiasm that seemed strange to the women. Why celebrate in a military camp? Why celebrate in a place of war? On Christmas Eve, Sergeant Rossi approached Ko with an unusual request through Lieutenant Chen. The mess staff wanted to prepare a special meal for Christmas Day. Would the women like to help cook traditional Japanese food alongside the American dishes? That way, everyone could share their cultures. The offer stunned her. They wanted to honor Japanese culture in an American military camp. After a war that had killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. She did not understand, but she agreed. The women spent Christmas Eve in the kitchen, teaching the American cooks how to make onigiri, miso soup, and other simple Japanese dishes with the ingredients available. The Americans taught them about turkey and stuffing and pumpkin pie. Christmas Day arrived with clear blue skies. The mess tent was decorated with paper chains and handmade ornaments. Tables were set with an impossible feast. American dishes on one side, Japanese dishes on the other. Soldiers and prisoners sat together, not separated, not segregated, together. Colonel Wright stood and raised his cup. He spoke, and Chen translated. 4 months ago, we were enemies. We fought a terrible war. Many good people died on both sides, but today on Christmas, we share a meal as human beings. We remember that every person, regardless of nationality, deserves dignity and respect. The war is over. We can choose what comes next. Today, we choose peace. The American soldiers raised their cups. Slowly, hesitantly, the women raised theirs too. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. They were not celebrating America or Japan. They were celebrating the possibility of moving beyond hatred. Co ate turkey for the first time. It was strange and dry and covered in gravy she did not understand. But across from her, Corporal Mitchell was trying on no geary and making a face that made her laugh. He looked at her, embarrassed, and she pointed at her own turkey and made the same face. They both started laughing. Two people from opposite sides of the world, sharing food and laughter, finding common ground in the universal experience of trying new things and not knowing what to think. After the meal, someone started playing a harmonica. American songs filled the tent. Then Fumiko began singing a Japanese folk song, her voice clear and strong. The tent fell silent. Americans listened to their former enemy sing in a language they did not understand, but the emotion needed no translation. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. That night, Ko wrote in her journal, "I understand now. The Americans did not break us with kindness. They showed us what we had lost. We had become so focused on duty and honor and sacrifice that we forgot what it means to simply be human. To laugh, to share food, to see someone from another country and think that is a person like me, instead of that is an enemy. This is their strength, not their weapons or their wealth, but their belief that everyone matters, even us, even their enemies. I came here expecting to die. Instead, I learned how to live." In February 1946, the announcement came. Repatriation would begin in March. The women would be sent home to Japan. The news should have brought joy. They would see their families again. They would return to their homeland. But instead, it brought fear. Japan was a broken nation, cities lay in ruins, food was scarce. The occupation was only just beginning. And the women had changed. They had gained weight, regained health, learnt English words, laughed with Americans. How would they be received? Would they be seen as traitors for surviving? For allowing themselves to be captured instead of dying? Yuki voiced what many were thinking. "I'm afraid to go back, not because of the conditions, because I am not the same person who left. I do not know if I can return to believing what I believed before. And I do not know if Japan has a place for people like me." The Americans prepared care packages for each woman, food, medicine, clothes, and a small amount of money. Dr. Hayes personally checked each woman's health one final time. Sergeant Rossi ensured everyone had enough food for the journey. Corporal Walsh gave Yuki his own jacket, the one with the Navy insignia, because hers was too thin. She tried to refuse, but he insisted. "You take care of yourself over there," he said through Chen. "You're a survivor. You keep surviving." On the last night, the women sat in their tents, packing the few belongings they had accumulated. Ko held the jacket Walsh had given her. American issue, Navy property. She should not keep it. It was inappropriate. But she folded it carefully and placed it at the bottom of her bag, a reminder of a place where enemies became human beings. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the sort of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. The ship that took them back across the Pacific was crowded with repatriated Japanese from all over the Pacific theater, soldiers, sailors, prisoners, all heading home. The women stayed together, a small group amongst thousands. They did not talk much. What was there to say? They were leaving safety for uncertainty, leaving abundance for poverty, leaving people who had shown them humanity for a homeland that had taught them to die. When the ship arrived in Japan, the women saw what the letters had described. Yokohama port was partially rebuilt. But beyond it, the cities were scarred landscapes, buildings reduced to rubble, people looking thin and exhausted, children begging in the streets. This was the nation they had been told to die for. This was the empire that had promised victory and glory. Ko made her way back to Tokyo, or what remained of it. Her family lived in a small shack built from scavenged materials in what had been her neighborhood. Her mother was thin as paper, her eyes hollow. But when she saw Ko, she cried and held her and would not let go. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost everyone. But you came back. You came back. That night, eating a small meal of rice and pickled vegetables, Ko's mother asked about the camp. What had the Americans done to her? Had she suffered? Ko chose her words carefully. She said she had been treated well. She said the Americans had fed them and given them medical care. She said she had been safe. Her mother stared at her. They treated you well? The question was not accusatory. It was disbelief. But we were told. She did not finish. She did not need to. They had all been told the same lies, and now, sitting in the ruins of those lies, truth was harder to speak than fiction. The women scattered across Japan, returning to whatever remained of their former lives. They did not talk publicly about their experiences. In post-war Japan, being a former POW carried shame. Surrender was still seen as disgrace. Even though the emperor himself had surrendered, the women kept quiet, blended in, tried to rebuild. But they remembered. Ko became a teacher like Fumiko had been. She taught children English and geography and history. She never told them about the camp directly. But when students asked about the war, about enemies, about Americans, she chose her words to plant small seeds of truth. Wars are fought by governments, she would say, but they are survived by people. And people, regardless of which side they are on, have more in common than propaganda tells you. Years later, when her daughter was old enough to understand, Ko told her the full story. About the jungle, about running towards the Americans, about expecting death and finding mercy instead. Her daughter asked why she never spoke about it publicly. Because people do not want complicated stories, Ko said. They want clear enemies and heroes. They want simple narratives, but the truth is complicated. The truth is that the people I was taught to fear showed me more kindness than my own commanders. That is difficult to accept. Even now, decades later, it is difficult to accept. She still had the navy jacket. Worn and faded, too old to wear, but carefully preserved in a box in her wardrobe. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, remembering the young corpsman who had given it to her, wondering if he had survived the rest of his life, hoping he had. And so the soap, the meals, the tent with a comfortable cot, the Americans who chose mercy over vengeance, all of it became more than just memories. They became proof of a truth that propaganda cannot teach. That enemies are people too, that kindness is possible, even in the aftermath of terrible violence. That survival sometimes means questioning everything you are taught to believe. For those 37 Japanese women who ran towards American soldiers instead of away from them. The smell of American soap, the taste of hot meals, the sound of laughter, shared across language barriers, became symbols they carried for the rest of their lives. They reminded these women that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, humanity can persist, that even enemies can choose compassion, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is run towards help instead of accepting death. Corporal Mitchell, who had shouted, "Don't shoot," their women on that September morning, later said it was the most important decision he made in the war. Not because it was heroic, he insisted it was not, but because it reminded him why he had fought in the first place. Not to hate, not to destroy, but to defend the idea that all people deserve dignity, even enemies, even in war. As Ko told her grandchildren decades later, hatred is easy and fear is easy. But seeing humanity in your enemy, that is hard. That requires courage. That requires you to question everything. And those American soldiers gave us that gift, whether they knew it or not. They showed us that we were more than propaganda. We were people, and so were they. And that is the story worth remembering. Not just a story of war, but a story of what happens when people choose compassion over cruelty. When they choose to see humanity instead of enemies. When they choose, even in the smallest ways, to be better than the conflict demands. These stories matter because they remind us that even in the worst moments of human history, kindness remains possible. And that might be the most important lesson of all. History is not only about the battles we remember, but about the human moments we often forget